Hello, and welcome back to this year's Summer University. Thank you all for joining us. This is session 11, Global Britain Cooperation in a Competitive Age. Throughout the session, we encourage you to submit your questions using the chat box. Questions will be submitted, will be available to the moderator, and please do submit your questions directly as soon as they pop up in your head. The session is recorded and streamed, and therefore we are not acting under the Chatham House rule. Further, I'd like to introduce you to the session's moderator. This is Anthony Glees. He is Professor Emeritus of the University of Buckingham and certainly no stranger to this network. Thank you, Anthony, for being here, and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Felix. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here. My job as moderator is actually to stay out of this for as much of the session as is possible. I do have a particular interest in security, therefore the government's March review of security and defence, which is a long-term strategic review intended to define the UK's position of particular interest to me. And it is not just about security as in security, it's also about security as bolstered by trade. So we've got two fantastic speakers to explore these issues. And I do hope people will chip in. I'm against things that are too orchestrated. The more spontaneous this discussion can be, the more profitable I think it will be for those tuning in. So our first speaker is Stephen Booth, and Stephen works at Policy Exchange, and I'm sure people will know there's a highly influential think tank, now very close to the government, led by Dean Godson, now Lord Dean Godson. And usually what Policy Exchange thinks today is government policy tomorrow. So that's a very fascinating thing to have. And Stephen has done many other things, most notably perhaps work for the Open Europe think tank. Our second speaker, Georgina Wright, has also done a vast amount of extremely impressive things. She's head of the Institut Montaigne's European Problem. She's been a visiting fellow at the highly prestigious German Marshall Fund, and she's worked with NATO and the European Commission. So I don't think you could have a better panel, to be honest. And I've been asked by our highly gifted inspirator, if I could call him that, James Ellis, to just outline the three areas that I think should be discussed in this meeting, set in the context, and not just of the integrated review in detailed terms, but also our entire attitude towards the European Union and the future of Europe. And the last thing I really want to say is that when Her Majesty the Queen was hosting Donald Trump in 2019, when he came to the UK on a state visit, this was a time when President Trump was speaking very clearly about his idea that he'd pull out of NATO and that we should forget the American umbrella. And the Queen, in a speech that may have been written for her by Theresa May, I don't know, said, as we face the challenges of the 21st century, the anniversary of D-Day reminds all of us that all the countries have to work together. And she went on, after the Second World War, Britain and the United States worked with others to build an assembly of international institutions. And we are forever mindful of the importance of these structures. So nations working together to safeguard our peace. And if the Queen says it, it's important, and maybe it encouraged Trump to forget the idea of pulling out of NATO. But the world in 2021 looks very different, as if we've lost sight of this great mission after the end of the Second World War to produce international institutions that would work together. And of course, the European Union was one of those international institutions that was developed in the aftermath of the Second World War. So the three thematic points: first of all, the integrated review. What does it really mean? It doesn't mention the European Union very much, but it does go on and on about homeland, our European homeland, and that our first priority is to secure our European homeland. And I'd like our speakers to tell us in terms of that review whether anything is missing or anything is surprising to them about that review. And the second theme will be the shifting landscapes and perspectives of security cooperation. What if it is Olaf Scholz as the next German Chancellor? Will Macron make it? My distinguished colleague at King's College London, Professor Peter Neumann, a terrorist expert, just announced a few minutes ago he's joining Lachette's team as their national security advisor. This is quite a big deal as to who is actually going to win. And then finally, having looked at how our European former partners and hopefully our friends look at this big strategic statement, what needs to be done in policy terms to ensure the political security of the West, obviously in the aftermath of the abject withdrawal from Afghanistan? Why has there been so little cooperation between the UK government and the European Union as a security actor? And again, we see in newspapers this morning, Joseph Borrell is saying there has to be a European Union rapid reaction force. What's Britain's attitude going to be with that? So thank you very much indeed. Stephen, yeah, you're listed as the first speaker. We hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you to the Ideas Network for the invitation. Yeah, I guess I will start on the first theme, and then we can address the others as we go along. I mean, I think that firstly, sort of the moniker Global Britain clearly, to its critics and maybe others as well, it's seen somewhat as an abstract concept sometimes. I think the integrated review did quite a good job of articulating what Global Britain really means, in the sense that, I think you mentioned this in your opening remarks, Anthony, that while trade wasn't necessarily part of the title of the review, which was officially about security, defence, development and foreign policy, trade was clearly hugely important as a theme running through the document. And I think it illustrated that for Global Britain, this is as much about sort of trade, prosperity. The domestic agenda of levelling up is also runs throughout the document, as well as our stance in terms of foreign policy. In terms of sort of surprises in there, I guess there was a lot of media attention to the Indo-Pacific tilt, something that Policy Exchange was we did lots of work on prior to the review. But I think arguably, actually, it wasn't as prominent a feature of the review as lots of the commentary necessarily made out. I think you made the point, Anthony, that the sort of the Euro-Atlantic region was very much central and remains central to the way the UK sees its role and its interests going forward. The question, as which we are going to address now, and I think is a long-term one, is how do you do that tactically and operationally, and what is the role of NATO in that? What is the role of the EU in that? And what is the role of our sort of bilateral relationships with important member states or coalitions of smaller member states, which clearly already exist to some degree, but we may seek to develop or build upon. But I think, again, it's not surprising that the review identified three major regional hubs, i.e. the North America, Europe, the Euro-Atlantic region, and the Indo-Pacific. I mean, Brexit or no Brexit, I think the UK had to look increasingly how to position itself given the rise of Asia, both in terms of an economic forum, but also where increasingly sort of the geopolitical battle between the US and China is playing out. The UK is clearly pushing a closer engagement with India, but also Japan through things like accession to the common or the CPTPP grouping of Indo-Pacific states. So again, I think it illustrates that trade runs through the UK agenda. I think, yeah, there are big question marks about what this means for UK-EU cooperation. I think it wasn't surprising given the proximity of the integrated review to some quite testy politics between the UK and the EU, that there wasn't a great deal of detail about how the UK sees that working with the European Union. I think there's also, the reality is also it's not quite clear how the UK does engage with the European Union, which itself is undergoing very sort of detailed debates about how it goes forward as a union in terms of foreign policy cooperation, security cooperation. It's not clear exactly what the UK will be engaging with as that develops. So I will leave it there for my sort of broad comments and see how we get on.
Fine, thank you very much indeed. Georgina, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, and my thanks to the Ideas Network for the invitation. It really is a privilege to be with all of you. And the advantage of going after Stephen is that, you know, he's picked, sort of already said most of the things that I was going to say, so I will be a lot shorter. I completely agree with Stephen that, you know, the review clearly is very ambitious. There is a lot in there, you know, it's a 2030 outlook, it goes beyond COVID, and, you know, we forget this now, but at the time when it was, you know, it was supposed to come out earlier and the publication got delayed, but actually we were in the, you know, right in the middle of a pandemic. It was really difficult to think about something else. And we had the UK actually, you know, published this quite substantial strategy of how it's, you know, how the UK sees its role in the world after Brexit, answering many of the questions that a lot of its allies had. I also think that the government made very clear that it's a work in progress. So it's like a template, it's a guide, but actually it can be modelled and changed over time to, you know, react to ongoing crises or whatever new. We hope there won't be another pandemic, but if there is one, to be able to really emphasise the resilience, a focus on resilience and an ability to respond quickly. And I completely agree with Stephen that I think it's quite clear throughout the review that the UK sees itself as a European power and, you know, a guarantor of European security. And that was again kind of reiterated by the Prime Minister in his Munich Security Council speech, and then again by the Foreign Secretary in his speech to the Aspen Institute after that. So I think, you know, if you read the review and actually you listen to what the Prime Minister and his, you know, cabinet is saying, it's quite clear that yes, there is a pivot and there is a willingness to do more outside of Europe, but there is still very much a focus on being present and active in the European neighbourhood. There was quite a lot in there on working with European allies. You know, a real emphasis on bilateral relationships. So obviously the US is the UK's principal ally, but France was mentioned, I think, 11 times, you know, Germany 7 times, Italy got a mention as well. But the question I have really is that what can the UK do outside of the bilateral track? Because it cannot only rely on that. You know, that elephant in the room, what the UK does with the EU. A lot was said about the absence of a structured formal foreign policy cooperation with the EU. I'm a little bit less sanguine. I think true, the EU sort of wasn't all across the review, but when it was mentioned, the UK said it supported, for example, closer EU-NATO cooperation, and that it was ready to work with the EU in areas of mutual interest. So, you know, whether it's tackling biodiversity change, climate change, and of course threats of organised crime across the European continent. But I think that you know, there is a question about how that works in practice, especially given that the tone and the relationship is quite frosty now. And the second question is, even if the UK doesn't want a structured foreign policy cooperation with the EU, it will need a response to what the EU does. And there is a lot going on, Stephen said it, but, you know, the EU is about to publish an Indo-Pacific strategy. It's going to publish its big kind of review, hopefully in March 2022 under the French presidency of the Council of the EU. What's the UK's answer going to be to that? Is the UK government going to stay silent, or will it have a say, will it have a response to what the EU puts forward? So I think those are sort of interesting things that we'll need to keep an eye out for over the coming months. And, you know, the irony is that actually a lot in the review in terms of substance is actually very much shared by European allies. You know, take China, for example, a much more nuanced approach than the US's position. That's very close to what France thinks. You know, both the UK, France, Germany, but other European partners want to invest more resources in research, you know, cyber warfare, climate change, future pandemics, a really expansive definition of what a security threat is today. Defending the multilateral system, you know, using trade as a way to promote openness, because Stephen is absolutely right, trade is central to the UK's foreign policy now. So I think, you know, at risk, I don't want to sort of downplay the absence of kind of a UK-EU narrative in that foreign policy space, but I actually think that the devil will be in the detail, and we need to wait a little bit to see how that sort of really, you know, what happens in future.
Fine. Well, thank you very much. You know, very revealing introductions. I mean, Georgina, you say there's a certain frosty attitude towards the EU in the integrated review. But my initial question really to both of you, from your different perspectives, from Stephen in the bowels of Lord Godson's Tory think tank, government think tank, and you from the Institut Montaigne beyond these shores, you both seem to accept the integrated review at kind of face value. And for somebody like myself, a kind of unreconstructed European Tory, I think the review, it obviously has many authors, and we know that, and Professor Bew is the guy who's perhaps more Euro friendly. If you read the introduction by Boris Johnson, basically it is dismissive, but both of you seem to accept that this is a real statement of Britain's strategy, despite all the evidence that there is to the contrary. And, you know, Frosty may not sum it up, but you both accept it's a real statement that global Britain really means something. And I would just sort of say, you know, if this is a monument, where is it actually in real terms? The language is fine, but, you know, what actually does it mean? And maybe, Stephen, perhaps you can say, is all very well to set out, you know, what we want, Asia pivot, we want good relations with Europe, with this, we're a global leader. But how serious are we about that really? And where is the evidence that we're serious about it? Frosty in all senses, it seems to me. I mean, I think you can throw that integrated review away, frankly, but you clearly disagree.
Yeah, and just on a firstly, I would say that the policy exchange is non-partisan, but let me just put that out there. But no, I take your point, and I think the fact is actions speak louder than words, and we'll see what happens. I guess what I would say is that I think what I think is interesting, and I mean, if you sort of look back over history and say, okay, the UK joined the EU or the European Community as was in the 1970s, almost for a lack of alternatives at that point, having tried lots of other things post-war. I think if you look at the world today, there is actually an eagerness of some of our partners, particularly people identified in the integrated review, for the UK to take a more assertive role.
Can you spell that out, Steve? Can you be specific I think about what the alternative in trade and in security?
Well, I think it goes back to sort of something that sort of, for example, sort of William Hague talks about, sort of a more networked nation, one that is a bit more fleet of foot and works. It's still obviously we're a medium-sized power. We're going to have to work with partners, allies, coalitions, and that will, I think, hopefully, from my point of view, I did vote to remain, so hopefully that will include European partners as well. But I think we need to be sort of realistic. I think there is a certain degree of naivety in the European discussion that suddenly, because of one event in Afghanistan, suddenly the EU is going to galvanise into something it's proven unable to do for a very long time. But coming back to the other point, I think that the likes of Japan, the likes of India, I think are looking for some degree of UK engagement in the region, because with the return of kind of great power politics, the relative increase of power of China versus, say, the United States, we are living in a much more sort of multipolar world, which is, I think the EU was worked very effectively in a post-Cold War benign world in which we all kind of took security for granted. I think that in today's world, where foreign policy is going to be much more hard-nosed and interest-focused, I think the integrated review reflects that. I think the question that you rightly ask is whether we can actually match the words with capabilities, and I think that's obviously difficult in a tight economic environment. I think this government has put extra investment into defence. We have deployed major resources to the Indo-Pacific region recently. I think that this is about showing a commitment, that this is a long-term commitment to those areas of the world in which previously possibly didn't get as much attention. And I think that's why the trade strategy very much does go hand in hand with the security strategy, is seen as being mutually reinforcing. It's no accident that we're investing heavily in ASEAN, the CPTPP dialogues, at the same time as we're moving our aircraft carrier in the same seas.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very interesting observation. I wonder if Georgina can tell us how this kind of statement of Britain's grand strategy actually is seen in Europe, particularly by Macron at the moment, because the German question is now open, and whether the sorts of things that Stephen is saying, the intentions, actually, do they cut any ice? Is the United Kingdom, particularly after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where it's clear that, you know, whatever grand strategy we have is not yet effective. You know, how do they see this? Do they see it as a sort of Brexit dream, or do they really think that behind the scenes Lord Frost will agree to working together with the European Union on security matters?
So I have a couple of things to say on that. But before I do, I think coming back to your sort of first remark, Anthony, I mean, I'm sort of the person that tends to see the glass half full rather than half empty. And I think a strategy is better than no strategy. And I think that's how most European partners saw it. You know, for years, we've been hearing this slogan, I mean, actually years, hearing about global Britain, but no one really knew what that meant. And so I think that's why when the integrated review was finally published, you know, it was welcomed with caution, but it was nonetheless welcome, because clearly then there was at least a greater indication of what the UK's priorities might be. But, you know, for example, the fact that the UK is leaving the EU but not leaving Europe. I mean, we'd heard that over and over again, but actually, if you read the integrated review, it was quite clear that the UK, as I said before, you know, saw a role for itself in Europe. Wasn't.
But where, excuse me, Georgina, where is the sign that that is the case? Because the way it looks like, what it looks like is we are leaving Europe. We're not only leaving the European Union, we are leaving Europe. But you say that that's not the view taken in France.
It wasn't when the review was published. So I think there was a sense that actually, do you know what, there is in there a greater sense of clear commitment of NATO, as we know, but an emphasis on bilateral relationships, and all of that matters. Also working with allies to, you know, address some of these big systemic changes. You know, we mentioned it a bit before, but sort of climate change, biodiversity, but also, you know, maintaining an international system that is democratic and, you know, promotes shared values and all the rest of it. But obviously there were eyebrows raised, and that's exactly going to the heart of your question, which is, and Stephen, you know, has already answered it in part by saying, well, actions are louder than words. And in a sense, you know, the UK's review did come across a little bit like a wish list, but it's better to have a wish list and know what's on there than nothing at all. But there is going to be, you know, I think certain expectations on behalf of the UK's allies to say, well, out of all of this, what are going to be, where is the UK going to actually invest its resources? and what will the priorities be? And I think a lot of European countries are waiting to see what happens. The second thing, though, I would say, and I think is really important to remind people of, is the UK isn't front and centre of every European country's like priorities right now. There's a lot going on, and I've noticed it moving to Paris. The UK obviously comes up in conversation from time to time, but it's not, it's not the number one thing where people wake up and think, oh, what's happening with the UK? What are they going to do, and all the rest of it? So I think there's going to be a need for the UK government to continually outreach in probably the way that it does. But, after the review was published, there was an excellent diplomatic outreach trying to kind of explain what was in the review, making sure that the key messages were communicated. But that needs to continue. You can't rely on the G7 and COP26 to kind of cement your new global role.
That's very interesting. Skeptics might think we have to do more than just to speak loudly to foreigners. We have to actually engage with them. So explaining is one thing. But Stephen, I wonder if I could put a question which seems from John Knight's, which seems specifically aimed at you, bearing in mind, you rightly said, policy exchange is not the Conservative government, and I shouldn't stretch that side of it. But what John says is, obviously the integrated review is not going to consider a possibility of rejoining the European Union. But if the right wing of the Conservative Party were to lose its control over UK politics, and considering changing demographics of the UK, what do you think are the chances of, Stephen, of the United Kingdom one day rejoining the EU? Is this how the wish list will eventually become reality, long after people like me are pushing up the daisies? But when you as old as I am, do you think that's what is going to happen? Is this the pathway here, the very first steps, or basta?
I personally think it's a very small chance that we get to the point of ever rejoining. I think the debate I think currently there is very little debate about the EU at all in the UK, really, actually, other than sort of there are various attempts to relitigate Brexit and project that onto different discussions. But in terms of actually the EU as an issue in UK politics, it's minimal. I think we will have conversations about the kind of relationship we have with the EU, and I think that's the healthy debate we need to have. And I think there clearly will be different views about that, both within the Conservative Party but across the political spectrum. But I mean, it's worth noting that neither the Liberal Democrats nor the Labour Party are making much play of kind of the idea of trying to rejoin the European Union. That's not something that's on the agenda. And I think that if you look at what's happened in the European Union since we've left, and I think people made this point before the referendum, I mean, there has already been some quite big developments which I think will make it very hard for us to rejoin. I mean, look at the COVID economic response. That effectively was really about if we'd been members, that would have been a Eurozone only fund. It ended up being an EU-wide fund. The EU now can issue debt as a union. No way a British Prime Minister would agree to that, a Labour Prime Minister included. So I think that we're already seeing the EU develop in ways in which I think it would be very difficult for any British government to rejoin. I may be wrong about that, but that's my judgment of it.
Well, sorry, can I just that's also my view, I have to say, but you say we will have to have conversations, and obviously that's a really important part of IN 2030 to solidify the concept of conversations. And can I just ask you, wearing your policy exchange hat, how many EU leaders has Dean Godson invited to speak at policy exchange? We had a very interesting session on Afghanistan with H.R. McMaster. We've had people from Australia, etc. Who's the last major EU leader policy exchange has hosted?
I've only been there for 18 months, so I can't necessarily comment on the full. I'm pretty sure that we had some. I think we had Jens Spahn fairly recently, actually.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, yeah, and I think that reflects. And ultimately, it takes two to tango, right? And I think part of this forum should also be about. I mean, I've often been, as I said, I voted to remain in the referendum, but I'm used to being the token Eurosceptic on all of these panels. I've been doing this for 10 years, and that's always been my role. I've been to many Anglo-German meetings with Felix, one of our hosts today, and it's like watching ships sail past each other in the night, quite frankly. And this is English-speaking German MPs and the left wing of the Tory party often finding it hard to actually have a realistic conversation about where things stand when it comes to the EU and the UK. So I think part of the job is, and I think this is something that is difficult in the current climate, is also explaining to the EU the reality of the situation and key figures in the EU, because I do think there has been a sense that okay, it will be like the 1970s again. The UK will be kind of economically on its knees and we'll have no option but to rejoin the EU. And I think, I mean, whatever your views on Brexit, I think we know enough that we are not going to be in an economic situation that we are going to have to rejoin for those reasons. And I think part of the Global Britain agenda is about illustrating that, both from an economic point of view, but also from a sort of foreign policy point of view, not something necessarily hard security, but the UK developing those relationships that not replace the EU, but balance the EU in terms of the importance with which the EU has been part of our sort of national and life and our foreign policy. That I think is going to change, and I think it had to change no matter what. I mean, if you look at the future of the European continent in terms of demographics, as it was mentioned, I think in a slightly different context. But I mean, the fact is, the world is changing. If the UK doesn't diversify its economic relationships away from Europe, it's failing, and that goes for every single European country, because the future is not European, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but you know the argument, Stephen, that the EU is doing this and that we're saying, oh, it's got to be done. They say they're doing it, but I agree with you. It's ships passing in the night. I wonder if I could just ask Georgina a question that's been put to her, which is that how can Europeans take the idea of the UK as a global power or even a regional power seriously if President Biden takes vital national security decisions on our behalf without even consulting us? And how can we be economically strong and do the things? This is in a way a question for both of you, this second bit, if our ability to be strong economically has been hammered by Brexit. And Steve may be right. I suspect he is right that what Lord Frost would say, what Liz Truss would say, is these new relationships, Asia Pacific, Trans-Pacific, etc., New Zealand, Australia trade deals, these are all going to supplant the European Union. And when that US trade deal happens, if it ever happens, that will bolster it. But in the meantime, as the integrated review points out, Europe is our largest single trade partner by some measure, and yet we've cut ourselves off from all the benefits. And as John Bowis says, this is particularly seen at the moment in the distribution problems we have here in the UK. Yes, they're COVID and they're global and all that, but when it comes to fresh EU food coming into the UK, that is very clearly a Brexit problem. So, how can we be this great global power if we are actually less independent now, perhaps, than we were when we were in the European Union? What's your view, Georgina?
So I will answer that excellent question. I'm just going to perhaps give a point of, or offer some clarification now that token European, given that I'm in Paris, but no one I meet, whether that's in Paris or Berlin or Brussels, talks about the UK rejoining the EU. I mean, people are very much accepting that is the way that it is. It's just that there are lots of other things going on. So I really would, I would counter that view sometimes that is held that the EU won't accept that the UK has moved on and won't. I think the EU is very ready to accept that, has accepted and is very ready to look at other ways. The problem is, and Stephen's absolutely right, it takes two to tango. Now, from the EU expect from the UK, EU being, individual European allies, or whether it's the EU as a whole, now even more clarification as to what are going to be the priorities, what resources can the UK put at its disposal, who are the which European allies is the UK going to prioritise. But equally, the EU as a whole needs to get its act together. I mean, France and Germany have huge differences in opinion over what European foreign policy means, what European Une Europe de la Défense means. We have the EU's foreign policy chief talking about a rapid reactionary force, and then the next day you've got foreign ministers going, oh no, absolutely not, that's not what we meant, and anyway, it would require unanimous decision by all member states to. I mean, it's the perennial problems of trying to get the EU to agree one policy that in the foreign policy space that is not the lowest common denominator. And I think until the EU manages to agree some form of strategy that is more ambitious than what it has now, it will be very difficult to see how the UK and the EU, what they can do together, or what the UK and individual group of European countries, or what the UK does bilaterally with individual countries. So I think it's both need to kind of be even clearer on their intentions and what they want to do. Now, in terms of the EU and what it sees, does it see the UK as a credible partner, especially now that the special relationship seems to have been rocked slightly? I mean, clearly there was a question of, prior to 2016, it looked like British foreign policy relied on two pillars. One was the special relationship and the other was the central role in Europe, and both took a bit of a knock. And that was also with Trump, by the way. There were lots of questions about what the special relationship would look like after Trump. But I think, it was quite interesting that Paris rang up London, or London rang Paris, but either way, they were talking to each other pretty much immediately once Kabul had been taken over, the fall of Kabul, and they were trying to see how they can work together to form a European-wide response. But I think most of that cooperation is going to happen within NATO. And that's one, because the UK prioritises NATO, but also because that's where most of the collective defence thinking happens right now. And I think that European countries perhaps aren't thinking enough or asking that question of where the UK is and how the kind of Brexit and a more kind of maybe inward-looking US affects its standing in the world. At the moment, they're very much in the kind of, okay, what do we need to do? What does Afghanistan tell us? And what can we do as a continent? And I think that may push the European countries and the UK to work much more closely together, not only in terms of reacting in specific, whether it's like stationing troops along borders, but also in terms of strategy. But I think we're not going to see anything really until after the French election, because it's going to be very difficult to see how that could work without, clarity about who's going to lead the other big European security guarantor.
Of course, I don't disagree with you, but that is a cop-out in a sense to say, the Taliban are not going to wait on the outcome of the French election. The Taliban are not going to wait to see who's going to be the next German chancellor if they are minded not to do so. And we could find, I hope we don't, but we could find Afghanistan degenerate into civil war over the next few weeks. So I do think
Sorry, Anthony, I just find it very difficult to think that they could do anything autonomously or independently from the US. I mean, Le Drian today, so the French foreign minister, who on the record said, this what's happening in Afghanistan doesn't mean the decline of the United States. I mean, that is quite something for a French, foreign minister to say that, and basically trying to show that, yes, the EU or Europe as a whole needs to do more, but also we cannot at this point be completely independent from the US. So I think a lot of the thinking about what they need to do next will in some shape or form involve the United States.
But surely, I'd like to come to Stephen in a second, I just finish that point. The phrase we used to use was, go tell that to the US Marines. So the comment that, nothing has happened in America and we can rely on America as before, the ordinary voter is not going to find that very convincing. In all the years I worked with the European Ideas Network and spoke to MEPs about security, I always found, I'm a very junior fish, but I always found it was one of the things they least wanted to talk about. It was most convenient to say, oh, well, we've got NATO and this and that. etc. But sometimes in life, you don't have the luxury of being able to choose the threat you face. You have to take but Stephen, the question that John Bowis is asking is, how can we be strong as global Britain, whatever that means, given that global Britain, that the document says our ability to be global is predicated on a strong economy. How can that be when Brexit, certainly in the short term and probably in the medium term, has meant that our economy is weaker? And you don't have to take my word for it. Lord Frost himself said in the House of Lords yesterday, freedom does not come free, which is a way of saying, oh, you voted for Brexit, you voted to be poorer. And if we have a smaller economy, how on earth can we project as a global security power when we don't have the economic strength to do that? And you say, oh, it's not like it was in the 1970s. But I could say, actually, it's very like it was in the 1970s. In fact, ever since we thought of getting into Europe after the Second World War, the fact was we couldn't afford. We needed massive immigration for our labor market. We still do. And we couldn't afford a global presence, and we still can't. What's your view, Steve?
Well, I think clearly it comes back to what you think the cost of Brexit is. I think clearly there is a short-term drag on the economy. I don't think it is anything like the order of magnitude that would lead us to rethink kind of fundamentals such as you've discussed. I don't see that. That's not. I don't think what's happening. And I think, and again, it sort of goes back to. I mean, you can make the argument that Canadians would be richer if they joined the United States. I mean, it's a question of degrees, right? It's a question of how much friction there is at the border. I mean, I don't think anyone is saying the UK cannot afford to be an independent nation. I don't think that's a realistic argument to make.
But afford to be an independent nation and a global power. That's the thing.
Well, I think global power again is. I mean, I think we have to be realistic about that, right? I mean, I think the UK is a medium-sized power. We have to be realistic about that. I think the integrated review makes. I mean, the areas in which the integrated review calls for the UK to be a genuine sort of global power are actually quite soft areas in terms of the economic side of things, being a leader in certain services sectors, being a leader in new technology, data, and so on. So leveraging our strength to sort of a knowledge economy. So that's I think slightly different to what we're talking about in terms of hard foreign power. I think the integrated review is pretty realistic, but that has to be done in concert with our allies, and I don't think that's controversial. I think, and it comes back to another point that Georgina made. I think that global Britain's success, we do have to have a realistic and a sort of convincing narrative that we're not simply caught between two stools of Washington and Brussels or Paris and Berlin. That for global Britain to be a success, we do have to ensure there's a third leg to the stool of global Britain, which I think we comprise of many different parts. And I think the Indo-Pacific tilt is clearly part of that, and probably the biggest part of that. And I think that's what that has to be about. But just coming back to sort of one other point that we've been discussing, and I think Georgina was talking about, which is sort of the UK-EU aspects of this. I think it is worth remembering that sort of the way that the Brexit process played out was that the EU was very keen to see that security and trade were separate tracks. I mean, the UK would have been, I think, much happier, particularly under Theresa May, to have a conversation which was a genuine partnership in which the EU recognised the UK's contribution to European security, and that was reflected in the broader package, i.e. in some degree of in terms of a bespoke relationship on the economic side. Now, what we've ended up with is, yes, it's a bespoke relationship, but as the EU has been at pains to tell us, we have to have a third country relationship with the EU because that's the only model that they will give us. At the same time, the EU is now much more interested in greater foreign policy cooperation with the UK, and I think again, there's a slight naivety in that on the European side, in the sense that these things can be entirely separate. That the political landscape in the UK doesn't look at these two things and say, okay, well, we're actually getting less than the Canadians get in certain aspects of access to the single market, but you still want us to be integral to some of the security and foreign policy discussions that are happening. And I think that makes this happening in an EU-UK framework very difficult in the current context, and hopefully that will change. But I think that's why I agree with Georgina that I think we're going to be discussing this in a sort of in various other formats, be it bilateral, E3, within a European pillar of NATO, but that ultimately does depend somewhat on the direction the EU takes. I mean, Eastern European states are all up for that, but I think the way that, say, France discusses these issues, I mean, the language of strategic autonomy is very difficult, I think, to comprehend, not just in the UK, but also parts of Eastern Europe. And they kind of autonomy from who? I mean, are the French saying they're going to protect Eastern Europe in place of the US? I think there's some very difficult discussions to happen here, and a lot of that will actually depend on what happens internally within the EU as much as it happens in the UK.
Well, but you're raising, looking now to the future, Stephen, and indeed Georgina, you're raising a very interesting kind of idea that, yes, ships passing in the night, we are going to plod Lord Frost's hard Brexit path, despite the fact nobody in Britain ever voted for it or for him. But this is the route we're going down because of the majority of the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson having Parliament. We're going down this road, come what may, and British people can do without food or whatever, but that's what we're doing. Nevertheless, even in the integrated review, even in that multi-authored statement of high policy, we see ourselves as a European power with European security needs. So if you were going to say, what conversation do we need to have first in order to realign in some way? Because, the Brexit vote, and it's a cliche, but it's true, the Brexit vote didn't change the shape of the globe. Would you, Stephen, and would you, Georgina, lead on the security offer? Would you make the security offer? Because it's not just our armed forces, it's also our security and intelligence community, which fuels and it is very important. And we know that our spooks always said, Brexit or no Brexit, we will continue to cooperate bilaterally with our sister intelligence services in Europe. Is that what you think should be at the heart of the first big conversation as we look into the future and towards 2030? Should it be security and then build on that?
Well, just very quickly, I think personally, if I was the UK, I would be looking at this and saying, look, we will continue to do this on an ad hoc basis, because it really isn't clear what formal UK-EU cooperation looks like without knowing what the EU wants to do. And I think that's an open question. I mean, the formal cooperation that was offered to the UK throughout the Brexit process was, we will decide everything and you can join at the last minute. That was the offer in effect. And I mean, again, that's not a realistic offer to put to a country like the UK, given the politics, but also given the size of the UK, to put it mildly, in these areas. So I think until that offer changes from the EU side, it's very difficult to see how the UK responds positively, I think. But I don't think that means that there won't be cooperation. I mean, we've already seen it. We've seen it on sanctions. We've seen it in other areas.
Okay.
I think, but I think it will be ad hoc as opposed to formal, because I think
ad hoc. Is that your view, Georgina? Ad
well,
hoc.
I would say there's been a big development since the TCA was, negotiated and signed and then eventually ratified on the EU side, was the EU-US summit. Now, obviously, there are questions about whether we're going to see anything that came out in that summit come to fruition, particularly given the latest developments. But it was interesting that the US recognised, I think for the first time formally, the EU's ambitions to become a defence actor of sorts. And secondly, the EU and the US said that they would work much more closely on research cooperation in defence, but also granting the US access to PESCO and to some of its other initiatives in a way that is not, we plan everything and then we give you the option, but actually is much more strategic. And so the question is, if that was on offer for the US, will it be on offer for the UK? The difference at the time of the EU-US summit was obviously that President Biden clearly made the EU as an institution, as a union, a priority. And I think in a lot of my discussions with diplomats, EU diplomats, they say it's very hard. There's a lot of willingness on the UK side and on our side to continue to work together, to do a lot more, but it's really hard when the tone of the debate is still very fractious and frosty and whatever you want to call it. And so, Stephen and I have done these panels before and we've had chats on the side. Perhaps there was always inevitably going to be a period of mourning before we can really think constructively about what the UK does differently, what it does together with its European partners. But yeah, I just think it's perhaps too early to say, and a lot will depend over the next couple of weeks and months and years and all the rest of it. But again, I come back to my point. I just see it's going to be very difficult to see anything really until we know who the next French president is.
Alas, we're leading towards the end of this session. We just have a few minutes left, but I wonder if I could ask you both again to solidify in kind of planning terms. Obviously, neither of you make high policy, you just feed into the policy process. But if people wanted something concrete to do in order to ensure that the ships passing in the night don't get so far apart that the idea of working together in any size, shape or form disappears in time, what would that be? I mean, if you had to put money, we know that Boris Johnson will put money into anything big, a new bridge, a new tunnel, this, that, the other. But if you could advise him to put money into something that would promote dialogue, what would it be? Would it be academics? Would it be people like yourselves? Would it be student exchanges? Would it, what would it be? Because you're not going to get the present government, you're not going to get the present government agreeing to the sort of dialogue because they're too terrified of the European Research Group to do that, even if they think it could be in our interest. So what would you propose to get things moving?
Well, I'm happy to go first. I think there's a series of things that aren't not simply on the UK side. So I think there are sort of, I think, some precursors that need to happen. I think that some of the more knotty issues that we're still left with from Brexit, I think, need to be resolved. I mean, the Northern Ireland Protocol being one which is clearly, I think, continues to be a sort of fly in the ointment. And I think until that is resolved satisfactorily from both sides' point of view, any kind of meaningful greater cooperation is going to be quite difficult to see. I do think that the UK needs to invest in terms of engagement, both bilaterally, and I think probably bilaterally at the first instance with different European capitals, not just with France and Germany, but for example with the Eastern member states, Central and Eastern European member states. If we want to make the case for a European foreign policy firmly embedded in NATO, I think we need to be working much more closely with those countries. I think on the European side, I think some of this is a discussion that's ongoing in terms of what the EU really wants to do in these areas, and what does a geopolitical EU mean? What does strategic autonomy mean? These are questions the UK can't answer. But these are discussions that I think will be important to the future shape of any UK-EU cooperation. And I think that I think for a more fruitful relationship, I do think the EU needs to accept that the UK is simply not simply a third country in the European space, a la Norway or Switzerland. That actually, if you're talking about a genuine broad-based relationship, it should encompass the broad range of things, which include foreign policy, security, hard and soft, and they are things that cannot simply be put in a separate box to the economic relationship. I do think there has to be, if you want that to be a healthy and fruitful relationship, I think there needs to be a degree of understanding that there is cross-pollination between the two.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Georgina's 40-year marriage ended in divorce, but Stephen is saying there is still something special about the two people involved, and that needs to be built on. And I wonder, you've only got a couple of minutes, I'm afraid, but if Scotland were to vote for independence and then apply to join the European Union, do you think that might be a joker in the pack?
Well, I'd say that it's very difficult to join the EU. Obviously, you need to meet a series of requirements, which Scotland now meets because, you know, the UK and the EU are very much aligned. But you'd also need to get all EU governments and all their national parliaments to agree to Scotland joining. I think now that the UK is out of the EU, that might make it easier for national parliaments to approve. But you can imagine a number of member states with regions that want to become independent who might not be overly, in favour or happy about Scotland applying to join the EU. So I would say, we'd have to wait and see if Scotland actually, the Scots voted for independence. But also, I wouldn't sort of then assume that Scotland would join. I think there would be, it would pose a tricky problem for the EU. On what needs to happen, I completely agree with you, Anthony, that a formal dialogue of sorts is probably the best way to address this, but it doesn't seem like a possibility right now. I think the UK needs to have a formal response to any strategies that the EU puts forward, in pretty much the way that, it doesn't have to be a formal on the record response, but at least diplomatically in kind of the same way that the French and the Germans responded to the integrated review. There's a lot that's going to come out over the next couple of months. It's important to take that seriously, and it's important to take it seriously not because the EU is, something that you have to take seriously, but because actually the EU is central to many of our European partners' foreign policy, and so we need to just be able to respond to that. Also have very good people in our embassies. That matters a lot. Interpersonal relationships, all of that kind of stuff. It matters hugely. And you need people who understand the EU as well, not only the country they're posted to, but also what the EU is doing, how the EU has evolved. Stephen mentioned a couple of things, but there are many other things that have happened since the 2016 vote. And finally, I think there should be greater cooperation when the UK and the EU, or when the UK and individual European countries agree and share the same interests in international organisations. So be that NATO, be that the WTO, and be much more public about that cooperation. We see eye to eye on this, and then maybe that's an example of ad hoc that Stephen was talking about, but in another setting, which is in the international organisation setting. I think all of that helps to see that we are moving on, that we can agree even if we don't always agree, and see that we have to actually cooperate sometimes because there are big challenges that require common.
Fine. Well, that's beautifully put. Very good to end on the note that we began, to remind us what the Queen said to President Trump about the importance of international assemblies and institutions as the great thing that we'd learned after 1945. I'd like to thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Final minutes back to Felix. I hope that he, like me, found your contributions remarkably interesting and important and future oriented, which is what I think his intention was.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Anthony, for your superb chairmanship, of course. And also, of course, to Georgina and to Stephen. I think especially these last comments on how to move forward are extremely valuable to us. This was the last of our open sessions of the Summer University 2021. And I thank all participants and, of course, all the audience for joining us. And I very much hope that you will join us next year as well. Next year's Summer University will be in September, and the precise date will be announced later. So please do follow us on Twitter. That's ideas_2030, or check our website, ideasnetwork2030.com. On the website itself, we will also publish some findings of the Summer University. And I'd also like to thank our co-organizers, the Wilfried Martens Center, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and the Conservative European Forum, for the joint effort to make all of this happen.